Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, All the Shelves. My name is Whitney and I am going to tell you about the books that I read in the first half of May. The first book that I read in May was American Passage, The History of Ellis Island by Vincent J. Canado. This is a nonfiction book. I read it right before I went on a trip to New York thinking that I was going to take a tour of Ellis Island. That didn't actually end up happening. It rained the whole time we were there. And we were thinking maybe not the best idea to go out on a ferry. But even though I didn't get to go on the official tour, I still do not regret reading this book at all. This book is quite dry. It's not written necessarily for an academic audience, but it still is really detailed, and he doesn't spend a lot of time on the personal stories of immigrants coming into the United States between about 1890 and 1950 or so. Instead, he talks a lot about the succession of power and how the White House and Ellis Island communicated and what sort of sparked different immigration policies in the United States. So it's heavy on the legal and political side and not so much on the personal and pathos side of the story, which I really liked. That's sort of what I was looking for. I have definitely heard arguments on both sides. I mean, it's more complicated than just sides, and I know that, but I have seen these sort of like pro you know, American immigrants during that time period. This sort of glossing over of the many difficulties they would have faced in the country. And then I have also seen the other side of it, like that movie that came out last year called The Immigrant, where depictions of coming into the country are seen as just god-awful, horrible circumstances. Now, I think that this book represents both sides kind of fairly, and I think it can do that by staying focused on the political, economic type circumstances and that kind of history. The one thing that keeps rising to the forefront of the book, though, is that there were people involved in immigration since the beginnings of Ellis Island to the end of it who had really good intentions in mind, good according to my political perspective, that would maybe, you know, be appointed because they were a hard ass and they didn't want very many immigrants coming in. And Ellis Island has, the book is very clear that Ellis Island has always been a structure that is meant to weed out people rather than to necessarily like filter them all through, right? Even though these people were appointed to be heads of Ellis Island and to determine who gets through and who doesn't, often they would be really trying to do what was right according to their own value system. And I think that that is something around immigration that we don't think about very often. And I think that this is the way that immigration is often represented in politics. On one side you have the cold sort of rational side, and I'm saying that all political perspectives could be kind of situated on that cold rational, this is what we need to do to regulate numbers, etc. And then on the other side you have the emotional aspects to the story, and again that represents all political perspectives, from the they took our jobs to the like let everybody in, like no borders, you know, type perspective, the drum circle type perspective. And I think this book does a really good job talking about the people who were appointed to represent the rational side of immigration, but who are still human and still responded to the emotional side of it. So in an earlier video I said that this book made me feel quite patriotic, and I think that's the reason. Not that there were a series of terrible political moves associated with Ellis Island. There are still ways within the American political system to work around those kinds of policies and to change those kinds of policies, and the book is often about people who affect those changes. The next book I read was Bag of Bones by Stephen King. I know that definitely switches gears quite a bit. I was looking for something that was long because I love long books on a plane, and I was looking for something that would be a super easy read that I could almost like skim through. And that was definitely this book. I wouldn't say that this is one of Stephen King's best books, although he says that it's one of his best books, which I think is really interesting. It's about a writer who has severe writer's block. Like, he'll turn on a computer and he'll go to start typing something and he'll start throwing up and like getting fevers and chills and stuff. And I love how he dramatizes the feeling and materializes the feeling of writer's block, because that is like a really horrible feeling, especially when your career depends on writing, which mine does. So I really related to that part of it. Writer's block just makes you physically ill. And so it's nice to see the character actually get physically ill. Anyway, his wife has just died and he's having a really hard time dealing with it, and he suddenly gets this urge to go to a second home that he has in like the Maine wilderness, I don't know, a small town. And that house, it turns out, is haunted, as so many houses in Stephen King novels are. I did like this book. I had a lot of fun reading it, but Stephen King can often be very repetitive with his ideas in the way that genre fiction often is, because it assumes maybe that somebody is not sitting down and reading it all the way through and that they would need those reminders of plot and themes constantly. The other thing that I didn't really enjoy about this book, and I don't know that we're meant to enjoy it, but I felt like the representation of violence in this book was really exploitative. And at the end of the book, this isn't a spoiler, but the writer starts talking about the use of violence in writing, and it almost seems like an excuse for how exploitative King had been earlier, and that just really rubbed me the wrong way, considering who the main characters are, who the story is mostly concerned with, and how the action revolves around certain characters in the book. I felt like where he positioned the violence was both unnecessary and very disturbing. So I usually like reading violent things, and I really like commentaries on violence like there is at the end of this novel, but the way that he did it unsettled me quite a bit, and not in a way that I think that he was necessarily intending. The next book that I read this month was Reinhold Niebuhr's The Irony of American History. This has been a really influential book on public policy and especially foreign policy in the United States. And when Barack Obama was running for president, he named Reinhold Niebuhr as one of his favorite philosophers. After reading the book, I see what kind of political purpose naming that out loud would have served for Obama, because a lot of what Niebuhr is talking about directly concerns the Bush administration and mistakes that Niebuhr would have definitely seen the Bush administration making. The book is mainly concerned with the kind of arrogance and irony that happens when countries assume that they can control history. So he has a problem with both imperialism and any kind of American policy that feels imperialistic, like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he also has a real problem with communism, which assumes that history is in a kind of circular path and that they can predict history. And he's saying, no, you cannot predict history, and when you try to predict history, you perpetrate unethical, egregious acts of foreign policy. And so I think that's particularly condemning of the Bush administration when they named certain powers the axis of evil, and they decided to get into a preventative war to prevent that axis of evil from apparently attacking the United States or infiltrating their ideas into other countries in the Middle East. The stuff that Niebuhr's talking about here just feels very prescient, and I see why Obama, distancing himself from the Bush administration as clearly as he did, would have named him as one of his favorite philosophers. The next book that I read this month was Boy Snowbird by Helen Oyeyemi. I had a mixed reaction to this book. On the one hand, I loved the first half, and I felt like it was very lyrical and really accepted the terms of the fairy tale that it was retelling, but then the second half got a little bit too, I'm gonna say YA, but I felt like it was YA in the way that YA tries to represent things realistically from a teenager's point of view, and that is not my favorite literary trope. So I immediately started seeing the story as kind of cliche in the ways that teenagers can kind of be cliche. So to backtrack a little bit, the story is about a girl named Boy. So already it's a little bit twee, as you can see, and she is the daughter of a rat catcher, a very abusive rat catcher, and so she escapes her home and she moves to this small town where she meets a man. This man already has a daughter whose name is Snow, and she gets along great with Snow until Boy has a daughter of her own who she names Bird, and Bird turns out to be dark-skinned, so she needs to figure out what in her or her husband's past could cause this baby to be darker skinned than, you know, anybody that she knows in either of their families. The book is a retelling of the Snow White story in a lot of obvious ways, dealing with appearances and mirrors and mirroring and gender. And I really liked how the book spoke about identity at first, but as it went along and things became more and more obvious, I felt like it just got a little overblown with its themes, was trying to kind of hammer them home maybe too explicitly. I think that a teenager might respond really, really well to this book because there is such clear allegorical moments that they might respond to, but as somebody who has maybe read a little bit more on identity, I don't want to come across as arrogant, but it kind of annoyed me, especially once I got to the very end, and I feel like the themes had been repetitive at that point. So the writing is beautiful, especially in the very first half. It's not like I wouldn't recommend this book, and I'll be trying other things by Helen Oyeyemi, but just not like my favorite. I've also been reading some plays this month. I read The History Boys by Alan Bennett, and I read True West by Sam Shepard. Of the two of these, I much preferred True West, but I didn't feel like either of them really blew me away. History Boys was about a history teacher who tries to teach like rebellion and an English teacher who is in sort of conflict with the history teacher. I mean, it's stuff that we've seen before. Like, I don't necessarily want to see the coming of age in the classroom story lately very much. You know, it felt like very Dangerous Minds. It felt very 90s to me. And so it wasn't a great reading experience. And then True West is about two brothers, one who is messed up, you know, like a disappointment, and then one who is a struggling screenwriter but doing okay. And it's about the brother coming into town, the messed up brother coming into town and really messing things up the way that messed up brothers tend to spread their mess up disease to other family members, and he does this to this screenwriting brother. I wouldn't necessarily recommend either of them. I'm just really interested in reading some more contemporary plays, so if you actually have some recommendations for me, that would be really great. I'm not looking for anything in particular, really, just some really great playwriting from the last 10 years or so would be so good. There were two other books that I read in the first half of this month that I'm not going to talk about here for two different reasons. One was Fic, Why Fanfiction is Taking Over the World by Anne Jameson. I recorded a fairly lengthy review video of that where I talk about my own experience with fanfiction and how I felt about the book, which was A+. I really liked that book. And the other book that I read was The Picnic at Hanging Rock. This is just the library bound copy, but here is the cover of the paperback, which I think is great. It's from the film adaptation, the Peter Weir film adaptation. This is by Joan Lindsay, and we read this for the Readers Inc. book club, so I will be doing a full video review on this at the end of the month. So wow, I had a lot of things to say about those books. My mouth is dry. I didn't realize I was going to be talking this long. I'm going to go drink a bunch of water and start reading some more. If you have any thoughts on the books that I have talked about, let me know in the comments section, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.